Hola y bienvenidos a LaVanguardia de nuevo en este ciclo de conferencias que inauguramos en el año 2020 y que nos ha permitido conocer a personalidades muy relevantes y de liderazgo en el activismo medioambiental. Hemos profundizado con ellos en muchos aspectos sobre cómo podemos ayudar a salvar nuestro planeta y dar las condiciones para que la sociedad sea mucho más consciente de ello. Ahora sabemos que tenemos ese gran reto y tenemos algún conocimiento más de por dónde podemos caminar para conseguirlo. Pero hoy queremos dar voz a la ciencia y para conocer cómo está avanzando para encontrar soluciones capaces de mitigar la crisis climática que tenemos. Para ello, hoy contamos con la doctora Ilissa Ocko, que es responsable científica de la Fundación Environmental Defense, que dirige el equipo de ciencia del clima. La doctora Ocko es licenciada en Ciencias e Ingeniería del Sistema Terrestre por la Universidad de Michigan y cuenta un máster y un doctorado en Ciencias Atmosféricas y Oceánicas por la Universidad de Princeton. En los últimos años se ha convertido en una gran divulgadora científica desde que en 2016 ganó un concurso de comunicación científica organizado ni más ni menos que por la NASA. En la fundación donde trabaja lo hace junto a economistas, abogados, expertos en políticas para analizar los impactos climáticos de los diferentes tipos de gases de efecto invernadero y desarrollan estrategias concretas justamente para la mitigación del cambio climático. Por lo tanto, es una autoridad en la materia. Saludamos ya a la doctora Ilissa Ocko. Bienvenida a estos encuentros de sostenibilidad de la vanguardia.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bueno, pues estamos ansiosos porque nos dé un primer enfoque, un primer análisis de en qué situación nos encontramos y qué soluciones podemos encontrar. Adelante.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about how we curb climate change both now and later. So let's start with where we are today. Over the past century, we've seen Earth's temperature rise at an alarming rate and surpass 1 degree Celsius above a pre-industrial average in recent years. And so 1 degree Celsius may not seem like much, but this level of warming globally has devastated communities and ecosystems worldwide, with more intense downpours, sweltering heat waves, damages to crops, a loss of snow for both drinking water and recreational activities, and even the spreading of diseases. And so where we are headed is that without actions to limit additional warming, things could get a lot worse. And that's not where we want to be. Where we want to be is in this green range here. These are our internationally agreed upon temperature targets, where we don't think we could be below these, although anything to limit warming will help. But we really don't want to be above this threshold because the impacts to society and ecosystems will just continue to get worse and worse the more warming that we have. So the big question is, how do we get there? And the key really is to reduce the amount of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. These are also known as greenhouse gases, and it is very clear to scientists that this is what needs to be done. And this is because scientists have been studying Earth's climate for over 200 years and have a really good understanding of what controls Earth's climate. So while many factors can change the temperature of the Earth, scientists are confident that the factor that is changing today is the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And a certain amount of greenhouse gases is normal and, in fact, really good for us because without them in the atmosphere, Earth's planet would probably be frozen. The problem is that we, as humans, and all the activities that we do to support society are adding more and more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every year. And so we're thickening this blanket around the Earth and trapping more heat. And this is causing Earth's climate to change. And humans, animals, and plants are not prepared for the speed in which these changes are happening. And so reducing greenhouse gases will require 3 actions. So first, we need to cut emissions from activities where we have cleaner alternatives. For example, like producing electricity from wind and solar and using batteries. Second, we need to capture emissions from activities that we still need to power the economy, but are really difficult to cut the emissions from. So this includes industries, for example, that produce chemicals and metals. And third, we need to remove gases from the atmosphere when we can't cut or capture some of our own emissions, such as by using nature or instruments to absorb gases directly from the atmosphere. But I want to emphasize a really important point, which is that not all greenhouse gases are created equal. And we emit hundreds of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, hundreds of different types of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So how do we know which ones we need to reduce and what will make a meaningful impact on curbing climate change? Well, there are 3 factors that make a gas matter for climate change. So the first is how effective these gases are at trapping heat, either themselves as a molecule directly or indirectly because they affect other molecules in the atmosphere. So for example, here are 4 commonly known greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and HFCs. And this is how they compare to each other in terms of how much energy they can trap. The second factor is how much of these gases we emit into the atmosphere. So for example, the HFCs may trap 10,000 times more heat than the same amount of CO2, but we emit thousands of more tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year than we do HFCs. And finally, the third factor is how long these gases can last in the warming and can last in the atmosphere, causing warming. So not only do we emit the most CO2 of any of these gases we emit into the atmosphere, but it can also last for thousands of years in the atmosphere, causing warming for generations. So when we put all of this together, we get a picture of how much each gas is contributing to today's warming. So for example, CO2 emissions in the past and present are responsible for nearly half of today's warming. And methane is responsible for more than a quarter. So the 2 of those pollutants alone are responsible for the majority of climate change. But I want to emphasize the importance of how long a gas lasts in the atmosphere and what that means in terms of today's warming and future warming. When greenhouse gases last for at least a century, we call them long-lived climate pollutants. And the significance of this is that they build up over time. So what this means for today's warming is that some of the warming they cause today is from emissions from a century ago. For example, around 40% of the CO2 emitted 100 years ago may still be in the atmosphere warming the Earth right now. What this means for the future is that it's hard to get rid of some of the warming that these gases have already caused because they're just going to stay up there. And so these gases ultimately control how much the climate will warm overall in the future, because what we put into the atmosphere going forward can cause warming for generations. So on the other hand, we have the short-lived climate pollutants that do not build up over time. And so what this means for today's warming is that almost all the warming coming from these gases, for example, the more than a quarter of warming we're experiencing right now from methane, are from recent emissions just within the past couple of decades. So what this means for the future is that the moment we stop replenishing the atmosphere with these gases, we can have a near immediate impact, and we can slow down the rate of warming during our lifetimes within the next few decades. So now, what does all of this mean in terms of how we get to where we want to be? Well, to limit the maximum extent of warming in the future, we need to eventually achieve net zero emissions of these long-lived gases like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, which means adding no more to the atmosphere than we can remove. And for slowing down the rate of warming in the near term, we need to slash emissions of short-lived gases like methane to immediately lower the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so it's really a combination of these two strategies that will curb climate change both now and later. So for net zero emissions of long-lived gases, there are 4 key actions that need to be taken. So first, we need to cut as much of our emissions as possible to prevent further buildup of these gases in the atmosphere. And this, for example, could be using renewable electricity instead of coal-generated electricity. Second, we need to cut these emissions as fast as possible, because every day we emit more will commit us to more warming in the long term. Third, we need to preserve forests. So this is a key one because forests store a lot of carbon. And so it would take 100 years to grow a new forest that will store the same amount of carbon as the existing forest. So if we cut down the existing forest, we can't just grow a new forest and then have the same amount of CO2 taken up by that forest within the next few years or even decades. It will take a century. So we really want to preserve as many forests as we possibly can. And finally, whatever we can't reduce or save by preserving the carbon stocks, we need to remove directly from the atmosphere with either nature-based or technological strategies. In terms of slashing emissions for the short-lived gases, there are 2 key actions. So the first is that we also need to cut as much as possible because that can almost immediately reduce the warming impact from these gases on the climate. For example, we can prevent natural gas leaks that emit a lot of methane into the atmosphere. Second, we also need to cut these emissions as fast as possible, because this can have an enormous benefit for reducing damages to society and ecosystems in the near term by immediately slowing down the pace of climate change. And so now I want to give a little spotlight on methane because it's not nearly as focused on as much as carbon dioxide. And I want to show just how feasible it is to reduce emissions of methane, which can have a near immediate impact on benefiting the climate. And then I also want to show what some of those benefits are. So fortunately, there are numerous strategies to reduce emissions of methane. So the 3 key sectors that methane comes from is agriculture, fossil fuels, and waste management. And so on this figure, it shows the breakdown of how much emissions today we think are coming from each of these major sectors. And so, as I said, fortunately, there are a lot of strategies that we have to cut these emissions, and many of which are affordable. And so it's possible to deploy and scale up these measures globally over the next 10 years. And we can make a really meaningful impact on what our methane emissions are. For example, my colleagues and I found that with existing technologies, so we don't even need anything new, we could cut methane emissions from these sectors in half by 2030. So cutting methane emissions from the energy sector is the largest and cheapest opportunity to cut methane today. Methane is the main component of natural gas. So anytime we produce natural gas or we transport natural gas, it can leak. And natural gas can also leak when we are producing, when we're mining for coal or when we're extracting oil, for example. And so there's a lot of sources of leakage of natural gas, but the majority of these leaks can be fixed with existing strategies. And many of this can be at no net cost because implementing these measures balances out the profit from saving the gas because it's a valuable product that you can now sell. So a colleague of mine once said that it's not rocket science, it's plumbing. And so fixing these leaks can be as simple as just tightening a valve. And it's honestly more of a challenge to find these leaks than fix them. but our ability to detect these leaks has rapidly advanced in recent years. And now we even have new satellites that will be able to identify where the methane is emitted from and how much is emitted. So we can cut a lot of emissions from the fossil fuels. From waste, there are a lot of opportunities to capture the methane from the landfills and to use it to produce heat and electricity. And also we can improve wastewater treatment, which can also reduce methane emissions. And so while methane emissions from agriculture are the hardest to reduce if we don't change our behaviors, for example, by eating less meat and dairy, there are new technologies that can really reduce emissions of methane from a cow's gut. For example, by including feed supplements that suppress methane production in the cow's stomach. And so that can be a game changer in the future in terms of lowering emissions from agriculture. And there are also a number of ways to improve how we manage livestock manure, which is another source, and also rice paddies, that is a further source of methane from agriculture. So taken together, these actions could reduce enough emissions of methane in the next 10 years to slow down the rate of warming by 30%. And so this is huge. This is something that could really make a meaningful difference in our lifetimes, while we also implement measures to reduce the long-lived gases like CO2 so we can limit the extent of maximum warming in the long term. And there are also additional benefits from reducing methane. So for example, methane produces tropospheric ozone, which is not just another greenhouse gas, but also a toxic air pollutant. So improvements in air quality from reducing methane emissions could have even more near-term benefits. For example, preventing 200,000 premature deaths every single year once we cut these emissions in half. And also by preventing 25 million tons of crop losses every year. So these are really major benefits to society that go beyond just the climate damages that we get from these emissions. And finally, we can also have long-term benefits from reducing these short-lived gases like methane as soon as possible, such as in preserving Arctic summer sea ice. For example, colleagues and I recently looked at the likelihood of preserving Arctic summer sea ice by the end of century based on different emissions reductions policies. And so we found that with current policies, we are not going to preserve Arctic summer sea ice by the end of the century. We expect that we would completely lose the Arctic summer sea ice. And if we get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by mid-century, which is a major goal of countries right now, then we have around a 50% chance of preserving the Arctic summer sea ice. So it's almost as likely as it is not for us to keep the sea ice. But if we cut methane emissions drastically within the next 10 years, just with existing technologies, all the ones that I just mentioned, we have an 80% chance of saving the Arctic summer sea ice by the end of the century. And so this is important not just for polar communities and ecosystems, but actually for the entire world, because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And so it's really important that we are able to preserve the sea ice. And so this is just one example about how cutting methane emissions now can not just help the near-term climate, but also the long-term climate. So the bottom line overall is that we have an unparalleled opportunity to considerably slow down the rate of warming during our lifetimes with many other co-benefits, while also protecting generations to come. And so I am really hopeful for the future. I see firsthand all of the exciting new developments, and we just need to come together to act on them and to get to a safer place. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctora Ocko, muy interesante y muy en positivo, ¿no? Que también nos gusta decirlo así, que estamos ante un problema muy grande, muy importante, pero que hay esperanza y que podemos trabajar juntos para que ese futuro no sea tan negativo, sino que justamente preserve las futuras generaciones. Le voy a hacer algunas preguntas en relación a lo que nos ha explicado y empezaré porque usted ha insistido mucho y ha dicho que la tecnología existente ya nos puede ayudar a la reducción de los gases de efecto invernadero. Pero me ha sugerido una cuestión que ha salido recientemente y que uno de los impulsores ha sido el propio gobierno de Islandia, con estas máquinas que dicen que captan el CO2. Es decir, que lo cogen del aire y lo eliminan o lo almacenan de forma que intentan reducir la cantidad de CO2 que existe en nuestra atmósfera. Y el gobierno de Islandia lo planteó como el gran paradigma, el gran salto adelante, como animando a otros países y a los inversores justamente para que esto fuera así. No sé qué opinión tiene, doctora, sobre esta tecnología, si cree que tiene futuro.
Yes, I definitely think it has a future, and I definitely think we need this type of technology because there will be certain parts of our economy where it will be really difficult to reduce emissions from. And so, as I said earlier, we don't want these long-lived gases to build up over time, and CO2 is the main one. And so anything that we can't reduce emissions from, we need to remove from the atmosphere, because if we don't, then we still are emitting CO2 every year. And even if we reduce CO2, because it lasts so long, we still keep increasing warming over time. But we cannot rely exclusively on these technologies. While several of them are on their way to being proven technologies, they still require a lot of energy. We still are having challenges with how to scale them up so that we can remove CO2 at a large enough scale for it to be meaningful. And so we need a combination of all of these different strategies. We really need to reduce as much as possible, capture whatever we can, and then also invest a lot in these technologies that we will definitely need in the future to help get us to this net zero point. So while I think that they're really important, we can't rely on them exclusively. We still have to do everything we can to reduce emissions.
Justamente se lo decía por eso, porque de su exposición se extrae de que todo lo que ahora mismo está en la atmósfera, sobre todo el CO2, tardará muchísimo. Usted ha hablado de siglos. Por lo tanto, lo que está ahí arriba lo tendremos durante muchísimo tiempo. Más allá de esa tecnología de la que hemos hablado, ¿usted conoce que se esté preparando alguna otra invento, algún otro artilugio, justamente para, más allá de lo que nosotros podamos hacer para no emitir más, para reducir lo que ya está, esa parte de manta gruesa que nos está tapando?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different nature-based solutions, for example. So we do have these more innovative technologies that are almost these synthetic forests to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But we also can use nature, and because nature plays a major role in the carbon balance of our Earth. So there's a lot of carbon that is taken up by nature and then also released into the atmosphere from nature. So there's also a lot of strategies being looked at right now, for example, in the ocean and on land, for example, in soils. Obviously growing forests is an easy one to visualize. So there's a lot of different options that are being explored from that perspective too, that can help speed up how much carbon is taken out of the atmosphere. But I also want to make it clear that not every CO2 molecule that we emit into the atmosphere lasts for thousands of years. Within the first several decades of CO2 being emitted, it's taken up in the ocean and it's taken up in the biosphere, for example. So around 50% of the CO2 that we emit, let's say any given day, in 50 years will be gone from the atmosphere. The CO2 that does not get taken up by the ocean and the biosphere, because they can't take up everything, then tends to stick around because it doesn't react with anything in the atmosphere. So I just want to be clear that not all the CO2 will be there forever, but there is a large fraction. For example, I think 20% of the CO2 we emit right now could be there in 1,000 years from now. So this is why it's a buildup issue. And there certainly are strategies that are being explored right now, in addition to just these synthetic forests, for example, through using nature and its way of taking in carbon from the atmosphere.
Permita que insista en este asunto porque, claro, la economía siempre se mueve por intereses, siempre se mueve pensando en qué puede ganar una empresa, una corporación, una gran compañía en una inversión que aparentemente no tiene retorno, que es captar CO2 para luego destruirlo o almacenarlo. ¿Cómo se puede animar a los inversores? Porque al final o son los estados, es el dinero público, o es el dinero privado. ¿Usted ve, hay alguna posibilidad de que alguien o alguna gran empresa decida invertir ahí y pueda haber un retorno?
Yeah, well, what's really been encouraging over the past several years is how the awareness of climate change as an issue has just really exploded across the globe, and a lot of people are really concerned. And so people don't want to support companies and be a consumer of companies that aren't taking initiative to act on climate. So there's a lot of incentive for companies right now to be cleaner and to reduce their emissions, because that's what the customers want. And the consumers can show that through their actions by supporting different companies, buying products that are more efficient, for example. I know that I do that as a consumer. I'm specifically looking for companies that are climate conscious. And so there's a whole perspective there that we're really starting to see shift through major companies, where they want to be doing their part and acting on climate. That's totally aside from, investor money and regulations or incentives to reduce emissions. So that's been really encouraging.
Imagino que está pensando en, por ejemplo, en España tenemos iniciativas que van por ley, obligadas por la ley, que obligan a las empresas que generan envases, les obligan a pagar un canon para que una empresa superior, que es estatal, se dedique justamente al reciclaje de esos envases. O, por ejemplo, acaba de salir una ley aquí en España que obliga a las tabaqueras a pagar un canon para recoger las colillas que quedan en la calle tiradas y que por ahí también pagan un canon. ¿Usted se imagina en el futuro que estas empresas que están generando estas emisiones de CO2 paguen un canon justamente para construir esta tecnología, la que hemos hablado antes, o la futura, para, además de no emitir más CO2, eliminar parte de lo que tenemos?
Yeah, I do think there will be fees that will be a part of it. I think it'll be a collection of a lot of different types of policies, including incentives, including fees, including regulations. I think it's a combination of a lot of things, and it will depend on the country. It will depend on the industry. But yeah, I definitely think there will be fees. For example, in the US, there could be fees for emitting too much methane from your oil and gas activities. And then you could collect the money from those fees and use it to prevent leakage and install the measures needed to reduce emissions. So I definitely think that fees are a part of it. I think it's a lot more than that, though. But I am the scientist that's finding the sound science that will tell us what we need to do. And then I definitely rely on my economists and policy expert colleagues to find the right solutions from that economics and policy perspective so that we can actually get these actions implemented.
Efectivamente. Pero vemos que hay conferencias como la Conferencia de París, la Conferencia de Copenhague, la última en Glasgow, que se dan acuerdos grandilocuentes que luego tienen pocos avances, justamente porque, como usted acaba de decir, todo va por países y por intereses. Hay zonas del planeta que están más concienciadas que otras zonas, donde además el tema democrático pues no está tan implementado y esa conciencia ciudadana pues no está tan implementada. En los encuentros que tenemos como el de hoy con usted siempre sale esto, ¿no? Que en sociedades como la nuestra, la europea, pues hay una conciencia muy amplia sobre este asunto, pero luego encontramos en Asia, China, Estados Unidos como los grandes emisores de CO2. Y el ciudadano de aquí piensa, yo puedo hacer un gran esfuerzo en mi casa, en mi caso, pues comiendo menos carne, generando menos basura, comprándome un coche eléctrico, pero si estos grandes, enormes, gigantes no hacen sus deberes, no avanzaremos, ¿no?
You're absolutely right. It's a problem because the atmosphere is one shared space. And what all of us do individually to the atmosphere will affect everyone. And I especially think about those poorer communities that don't even have access to clean electricity, for example, that are not contributing really at all to the climate problem and are getting hit the hardest. There have been communities that have lost their homes due to sea level rise. There are islands that have been completely consumed by sea level rise. And so it can be really frustrating. And progress is way slower than we want it to be in some of these bigger countries. And it really depends on the specific country, what's actually happening. And as we see in the US, depending on who's in power, it can completely change what we're doing to act on this problem. So it definitely is a concern. I will say, from being almost an insider to seeing firsthand all of the brilliant people that are working on this challenge day in and day out, I am very encouraged by innovation, by how smart people can be in finding new solutions. There's a lot of competition in a good way in terms of finding these opportunities to help. So there are a lot of things that are happening overall that will make it easier for governments to get to their targets and their commitments. We also have seen a major shift in the past several years, especially over this past year, in terms of more than 100 countries coming together to agree on a global methane pledge to reduce emissions of methane. We had never seen something like that before. Countries agreeing to end deforestation. There's countries that are upping their climate pledges. Yes, it will matter whether or not they follow through, but those are really good steps in the right direction. But the bottom line is it can be very frustrating because we all, at the end of the day, are, in this thing together, living on this planet, and it will take all of us to come together and act. And it's, if one country acts and does everything they can, we still could have problems, and that can be really frustrating. So it certainly is a challenge.
Y respecto, usted dice que es científica, que no entiende mucho de política, o en todo caso no se quiere pronunciar, pero la comunidad científica, ¿hay consenso en lo que usted nos está diciendo? Porque vemos algunos líderes políticos en algunos de estos países que no acaban de decidirse, no acaban de dar el paso en relación a la lucha contra la crisis climática, que se apoyan en científicos que, podríamos decirlo así, son negacionistas. Un poco lo que ha pasado con la pandemia del COVID, que bueno, había gente que era negacionista de las vacunas y negacionista incluso de la propia pandemia. Decía que era una invención y que bueno, que aquí no había que hacer nada. La comunidad científica, por lo que usted sabe, usted conoce, sus colegas, no solo en su entorno, sino mundialmente, ¿hay un gran consenso o también hay una parte de negacionismo en ese sentido?
Yeah, I would say that more than 97% of scientists who study climate change and have the academic credentials to back that up completely agree that climate change is happening. It's caused by humans. It's, going to really disrupt our lives and livelihoods, and we need to do something about it. And also that it will be more cost effective to act now than to wait until later to deal with all of the problems that are going to arise from climate change. So there's really no question across the scientific community at large. If you had a group of 100 individuals in a room that were all scientists, almost all of them would agree with this. And maybe you have one or two individuals that are, showing signs of doubt. And it's really unclear why some of those scientists are doing it. If they really believe it, there's evidence that, some of their funding comes from the fossil fuel industry. And so they're trying to support that industry. So it can be very frustrating, but is a very, very tiny minority of people that deny the science, and they just happen to be really loud. They're a really small group that's really loud, and so sometimes we disproportionately hear from that group of people. But also, if you look at, the thousands and thousands of scientific studies published in the peer-reviewed literature on climate change, almost all of them, it's the same thing. Maybe even 99% support this view of climate change being a major problem driven by human activities, that we need to do something about it or we will have major consequences. So there is really strong consensus on the science.
Bueno, por eso hacemos cosas como la de hoy, que es justamente hablar con personas de gran relevancia y de autoridad científica para subrayar justamente esto que nos pasa. Permítame también que entre en algunos detalles en relación a lo que nos ha explicado y que empiece por el tema de los polos, de los casquetes polares. Usted ha dicho que en el 2050... si hacemos las cosas más o menos bien, el 50% de los polos pueden salvarse. Pero vemos que aquí en la geopolítica se está especulando ya con que un día no exista el hielo y los barcos puedan pasar por el Polo Norte, especialmente, y ahorrarse mucho dinero en el tráfico marítimo. No solo eso, sino en los minerales, que algunos países están pensando ya, especulando en que si no hay hielo o hay menos hielo, podrán entrar allí a excavar o a hacer minas, etcétera, etcétera. Parece que hay un mensaje muy claro de que queremos conservar los polos, pero por el otro vemos que por la puerta de atrás hay una actuación como muy alentando a que a ver si un día se acaba el hielo para poder ejecutar esos planes. Supongo que usted, igual que yo, igual que nuestros espectadores, lo han leído y han sabido sobre este asunto. Claro, ¿cómo se frena esto? Porque por un lado nos dicen hay que cuidar el planeta para que no se deshiele y luego por el otro hay alguien que está esperando y alguien que no es menor, que son relevantes, son poderes económicos e incluso políticos. ¿Cómo se conjuga una cosa con la otra?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's similar in terms of, there will be some positive changes from climate change elsewhere. For example, a certain part of the world may be able to grow a crop let's say coffee that's valuable that they couldn't before because it was too cold in their climate and now it's warmer. So that's great. We want it to warm then so we can, grow coffee in more places. But really, the consequences so outweigh any possible benefits. And, even just from an economic standpoint. And so there's so many consequences that we will see in the Arctic from losing the ice. For example, for local communities that live there, the ice helps protect them. It helps protect their land from sinking into the rising sea level. It helps moderate storms, for example, by breaking them up. And it also serves as a source of food for hunters who use the sea ice, just like the polar bears do, for example. So there's all these benefits to these local societies, these local communities that aren't contributing to climate change, that would be really problematic for those communities if we lose the ice. And then also losing the ice can increase warming of our planet even more, which can, bring about all sorts of changes. And most relevant for people are the worsening of the extreme weather events. So for example, when you have a really bright sea ice surface in the Arctic, it reflects a lot of sunlight back out to space. And if we start taking away that ice, we're exposing this really dark ocean surface that is now absorbing more sunlight. So now the Earth is absorbing more sunlight than it was before, which then ends up warming the ocean and warming the Earth even more. And then that can play out in terms of really affecting extreme weather events across the whole globe. And those types of things are really damaging to the economy when we have major storms and powerful downpours that can completely ruin buildings, for example. So there's this whole chain of reaction of events that are so negative. So even if sometimes you can find a silver lining of, oh, this would be great because then we could do this, there are, for that one benefit, there are, at least a dozen horrible things that could happen that could, be really problematic for people. And then I'll also just add that it is a national security issue too, to have no ice in between the countries in the north. And so there are problems with that as well that need to be considered. So certainly there's really no reason why we should just let the ice disappear. It would be devastating for the entire planet.
Y no ha mencionado la subida del nivel del mar, que eso sería desastroso en algunas zonas del planeta, ¿no? Con el deshielo, quiero decir, de los casquetes, ¿no?
Sure. So it's sea ice, which is what we're talking about right now, losing sea ice, and that will not rise. That will not raise sea level. That's because that ice is already in the ocean. It's floating. It's just in ice form instead of water form, liquid water form. But you're right. It's the ice from the land, the ice caps, that melting ice. So that wouldn't really change shipping or anything. That's the land ice. And the land ice is water that is sitting on top of land masses. So it's not in the oceans. And so when that ice melts, it's dumping a lot of extra water into the ocean, and that is what's raising the sea level. So you can kind of think about it as you have a cup of water with ice in it. When that ice melts, your cup of water isn't going to overflow. That ice in your cup is the sea ice. But then if I take extra ice that was somewhere else and I start throwing it into my cup, yeah, it's going to eventually melt and overflow, and there's going to be a lot more water everywhere. So the sea level rise is certainly an issue, absolutely, for coastal communities across the world, and it's triggered by land ice melting and also just the oceans getting warmer, and then the water molecules kind of expand so that now there's more volume of water.
Hablemos, porque usted ha dicho que uno de los emisores, bueno, y además es cierto, del CO2 es la energía fósil, el uso de la energía fósil. En este sentido, lo que podríamos llamar el primer mundo está haciendo un cambio de chip y estamos pues avanzando a gran velocidad en la aplicación de la energía llamada verde o llamada limpia. Pues por ejemplo en los vehículos pues se está utilizando energía eléctrica e incluso ya algunas ideas sobre hidrógeno se está poniendo encima de la mesa y otras. ¿Cree que la velocidad con la que se están implantando estas nuevas tecnologías al uso cotidiano, ya no estamos hablando solo de las grandes corporaciones o grandes empresas, sino al uso cotidiano, está yendo a la velocidad adecuada para cumplir con los objetivos que las conferencias climáticas se están dando?
It's a really great question because there's a balance between, of course, we want to move as fast as we can, but we also want to make sure that these technologies are going to live up to their potential. And sometimes we jump in too quickly and get too excited by a technology and don't know all of the impacts that could happen when we use it. For example, when we started using diesel, we were really excited about diesel, and we went in and we started using diesel for all sorts of vehicles, and then we found out that it's really problematic. It's a major health issue, among other things. And so there's this tension between wanting to act really fast so we reduce CO2 emissions, but also wanting to make sure that we do things right and we're careful and we know all of the different effects from deploying a certain technology. And so hydrogen is a perfect example of this because it's moving really fast right now. Hydrogen has been around for 100 years in terms of humans using hydrogen as an energy carrier and using it for energy applications. But at the same time, we've never scaled it up to the level that it's being considered right now. And hydrogen, what many people don't know, is an indirect greenhouse gas. So it itself does not trap heat like CO2, but its presence in the atmosphere and us adding more into the atmosphere increases the amounts of other greenhouse gases like methane and tropospheric ozone. And so the problem here is that there are climate consequences from using hydrogen because it is the smallest molecule in existence, and so it can easily leak out into the atmosphere. And so we need to make sure before we start deploying hydrogen everywhere and shipping it around and piping it places and storing it in large amounts, we need to make sure that it's not leaking a lot, for example. And there are other, examples like that too. But so we want to move as fast as possible, but we also want to be really diligent about what we do and how we do it. And we want to be aware of the full set of impacts that could happen from these newer technologies that we're starting to rely on more and more.
Pues me acaba de dar una información muy relevante, es decir, que el hidrógeno puede no ser la panacea y puede no ser la gran solución. ¿Cuál sería, por dónde pasaría entonces? De todas las cuestiones que estamos conociendo, energía solar, la energía vinculada al agua, etcétera, etcétera, ¿cuál cree usted que es mejor y aplica mejor a este objetivo que tenemos todos?
Yeah, there's no one solution that will fit all problems. So basically, we're going to need a mix of different things. And there are certainly applications of hydrogen where we have no better alternatives. For example, using it for high heating in industries to make cement and steel, for example. So for things like that, it makes a lot of sense to use hydrogen. And in order to maximize the climate benefits, we just need to minimize the leakage. So we need to make sure that as we build out our hydrogen systems, we are really careful and calculated about how we do it. For example, co-locating a hydrogen production facility with its end use, so that there isn't a lot of distribution of that hydrogen. You're not moving it around a lot and therefore increasing the likelihood that it can leak. So there certainly are applications where hydrogen will be the way to go, maybe for aviation using hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels, for example. But I think a key rule of thumb, so to speak, is that if you can electrify, then you should electrify. Because, you know, the solar and the wind, that is really one of the leading strategies for lowering our carbon dioxide emissions and having very minimal negative side effects. And so we really want to, you know, if we can electrify systems, for example, in-home heating, in places that aren't super, super cold, and so we don't need a crazy amount of energy to heat that home, we should not be using hydrogen and transporting it and moving it into homes. We should not be using hydrogen for that. We should electrify and use solar and wind energy for that purpose. So it will really depend on the specific application we're talking about, the different options that exist, the different locations where you are in the world, what are your resources for wind and solar, for example. So there's really no one-size-fits-all solution. It will be a combination of things, and for each one, we'll have to think strategically about how to maximize the benefits. And one other thing I'll say about hydrogen is that it takes a lot of energy to produce the hydrogen. Hydrogen is rarely freely available as just hydrogen in nature. Like, for example, natural gas as methane is freely available. So it takes a lot of energy to just get the hydrogen from another molecule, such as water. And so because of that reason, it's a lot more energy intensive anyway to use hydrogen in your homes to heat your homes. And so for that reason alone, it could make no sense to use hydrogen, forgetting about leakage. It could make no sense to use hydrogen because some of that renewable electricity that could be directly powering those homes is now going to produce the hydrogen to then use that hydrogen. So you end up wasting a lot of your very valuable renewable energy source. And so unless we get to a world where we have excess additional renewable energy and we could do with it whatever we want, right now it will be more effective to use that renewable electricity to directly reduce emissions through electrification.
Uh-huh. Estamos llegando al final de esta conversación, pero me gustaría plantearle una cuestión que también es coincidente con estos encuentros que tenemos con gente como usted, científicos y divulgadores en relación a la crisis climática. Porque justamente, y al menos en España y en Europa, hay un debate ideológico en relación a cómo se debe afrontar esta crisis climática. Y me explico. Hay defensores de que para luchar contra la crisis climática debemos optar por un decrecimiento económico, por una marcha atrás, que eso algunos lo leen como una complicación mayor de la vida, o sea, de la vida a la que estamos acostumbrados, del bienestar que tenemos, que nos va a perjudicar, y luego otra línea de pensamiento que dice, no, es compatible la lucha contra la crisis climática con un crecimiento sostenible de la economía. Usted, de estos dos ámbitos, ¿en cuál se decanta?
Oh, I definitely think the latter. I definitely think that fighting climate change can go hand in hand with economic growth. It provides so many opportunities for new types of industries, for new companies, for creativity and innovation, and just a better world in general. I mean, there's a lot of environmental justice issues with the current fossil fuel system aside from climate change. For example, some of these fuels are really dirty and polluting and major health concerns. So not only are we creating a better world for ourselves in terms of the climate, but we're creating a better world for the people in it who don't have to breathe in these harmful pollutants that are really bad for their health. So I just think overall, there's so much benefit from this issue pushing us to just be a better, healthier world. And I think there can be so much economic growth that comes with that. And just thinking about all of the consequences that would happen if we don't minimize and limit climate change. For example, all the worsening extreme events, all the coastal damages from rising sea levels, that alone will be so incredibly expensive. That will be so much worse for our economy than right now transitioning into, a more climate conscious, climate friendly world.
Pues doctora Ocko, ha sido un placer y muy interesante sus palabras, muy sugerentes. Nos ha ayudado nuevamente, esto es lo que pretendemos con estas charlas, justamente concienciar a nuestro público, a nuestros lectores, a nuestros espectadores, de cómo podemos avanzar en un objetivo que nos beneficiará a todos y que a poco que cada uno de nosotros aportemos, hagamos bien las cosas, el planeta en el futuro para nosotros, para nuestros hijos y nuevas generaciones, se pueda conservar al menos muy parecido a lo que tenemos hasta hoy, que esa sería quizás nuestro deseo. Doctora Ocko, muchísimas gracias por sus explicaciones y mucha suerte, porque usted como divulgadora científica pues tendrá que ir repitiendo este mensaje y espero que acabe calando en las sociedades donde los vaya transmitiendo. Muchas gracias en nombre de La Vanguardia y en nombre de todos los espectadores que han seguido este encuentro.
Thank you for having me.